Hello and welcome to Corpse Club, the official podcast of dailydead.com. This is one of your co-hosts, Brian Christopher, and I am here as always, at least for here in the Morningside area, with my good buddy, Scott Drebit. How are you doing?
I am doing very well, Brian. Yourself?
I'm doing fantastic, and I assume that people listening will know that I said that with a PH because we are on to installment 2 of our Phantasm retrospective. And we are going to be talking about Phantasm 2, which I think is kind of an interesting side path in the universe of the Phantasm franchise. And we'll get a little bit into that shortly. But first, we want to talk a little bit about where are we in the Phantasm story, because this is one of the few franchises where it is kind of telling a complete story through all of the installments rather than, just kind of these one-offs with different people coming in and just telling like an A to Z story, maybe with some of the same characters. This is something where there's an overarching story that carries through all 5 installments. So we want to try and keep you up to date on what's been happening so far. So last time on Phantasm, the brothers Pearson, Mike and Jody, find themselves at odds with the Tall Man, a multi-dimensional monster making dwarven slaves out of their friends and family. With the aid of heroic pal and ice cream vendor Reggie, the boys take on deadly flying spheres and sentient appendages until finally burying the Tall Man in a cavern under a mass of boulders. At least that's what we're led to believe, until it's revealed that all of the events in the film are really kind of a coping mechanism that Mike uses to deal with the death of his older brother. Or was it?
That's a good question, and it's the eternal question, and we could ask this question in every episode, on every film, at every junction of the movie. From that description, Brian, I don't understand why people don't get it. I mean, that is pretty straightforward, your general run-of-the-mill hero's journey stuff. Yeah. You know what I'm saying?
There's definitely a direct A to B storyline there. It's a fairly linear narrative, and I don't get why there's confusion myself. But there is, and I think as we get into some of these additional installments, we could probably use some help in unpacking it. And so we have some support today. We have recruited an author you may know, especially if you're a Phantasm fan, but if you're also a fan of some other of some of your favorite slashers and classic horror movies, you might know this gentleman from books such as Taking Shape, Developing Halloween from Script to Scream, Taking Shape 2, the Lost Halloween sequels, Slash the Titans, The Road to Freddy vs. Jason, and of course not one but 2 books on the Phantasm series, Phantasm Exhumed, and then further exhumed, The Strange Case of Phantasm Ravager. Welcome to the show, Dustin McNeill. How are you doing, Dustin?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me. Always happy to talk Phantasm.
And we love getting fellow fans on board. So we are very much looking forward to this.
You were one of the first people that Brian and I thought of when we were doing this. And Brian was the one who said, well, if we can, we should get Dustin on for 2, because that's, in some ways, in terms of the behind the scenes, it's, I think, by far the most fascinating story of the series. So this one is, I think, custom built for Dustin. Not to say that he couldn't and won't talk about all the others, because this is the Phantasm world and we like to seep through, but we're so glad that we have you here to get us through well, I'd call it a monolith all by itself in this series, Phantasm 2.
And I think before we dig into that, we are interested to know, Dustin, as a fellow fanatic, what do you remember your introduction to the Phantasm franchise?
Yes, well, I was in high school when I saw the first movie. I got the old MGM DVD at a video store at the mall, and then it wasn't until a few years later in college that I realized there were sequels. There was a 2, 3, and a 4. And watching 2, 3, and 4, I watched them all the three movies back to back to back. It was pure joy. I remember the first time watching it, just thinking they took everything that I loved about the first movie. For Phantasm 2, they just like amped it up. The music, the effects, the death scenes, the tall man's evil nature, everything was just like on steroids. I loved it.
That's fantastic. That's great. And it sounds like then, so you have seen all of these movies. Your first time with these movies was in order. You've seen it chronologically.
Yes. I did, like I said, I did the first movie and thought that was it. Mm-hmm. That was the beginning and the end. And then in college, maybe 2004 or 5, I saw 2, 3, and 4 together. And just, that was when I really just fell head over heels for the whole franchise.
I love that. And it's also, it's interesting because it's, for me, I talked about this a little bit during the last installment. Phantasm 2 was actually my entry point into the series because I was probably around, I'd say, what would this come out in 88? So I was 4 or 5, probably around 5 when this came out on video, which is usually when I had to wait to see movies because we weren't much of a family for going out to the movie theater. So I was probably around 5 when this came out, and it's one of my earliest memories of the Phantasm series. I remember going over to a family's house and they just happened to have it going on, like in the screen in the background, and everybody's talking, doing their thing, and I'm kind of like, my attention is drifting over very specifically to, I think it was the beginning of the movie where they're extending into from the end of part 1 and kind of that extended prologue where they show what happened the rest of that night back in 78. And so, I was hooked in some fashion on this series very early. I didn't actually see the first one until years after that. So 2 was definitely my gateway into the franchise as a whole. I do think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, my appreciation of it has shifted in certain ways in terms of how it fits into the overall story. But I do very much like it for what it is. Scott, how about you? What can you remember about your first time specifically with Phantasm 2?
Phantasm 2 is of the 2 theatrical. That is the one I saw, and I didn't even know it was coming out. This was 88. I wasn't reading Fangoria regularly at the time, so I just happened to, it was a Friday night and I picked up the newspaper and I saw a huge ad for Phantasm 2, and I was kind of just taken aback. Saw that it was Don Coscarelli and Angus Scrimm. I had no idea who the young dude was on the cover, and I hopped on the bus and I went, and about a dozen other people in a theater sat with it, and honest to God, my initial reaction to it as it finished was I didn't know what to think of it, because by that point, seeing the first one at 10, I was so into it religiously, and then when this came out, it just felt like such a shift. Not like a betrayal. I'm not going to be that dramatic about it, but it had that different feel to it. It just wasn't feeling, to my 18-year-old brain, phantasm-y enough.
And I think we can't really dig into that without digging into the backstory in terms of the making of this sequel. We're looking at a landscape where it's the late 80s. We're kind of at the tail end of the slasher boom. This is when Nightmare on Elm Street 4, the Dream Master had come out, gotten a huge box office reception, and really kind of kicked off that MTV flavored, balls to the wall, really kinetic, kind of lots of humor elements added in. This was kind of where the horror genre, for better or worse, was going. And, I think but I think to kind of pass it over to Dustin, the story of a Phantasm sequel goes way back before that, to right after the success of the original. So, Dustin, do you want to kind of give us a primer on the path to Phantasm 2?
I would love to. I'd also have to say, Scott, I think you really said something very true just now, in that, if there's something disappointing about Phantasm 2, it's that it doesn't have that same flavor as the first movie. And I think because it had been 9 years, I don't know that Don Coscarelli can ever make that same kind of movie again. It's kind of like you can never really go home again. Because after Phantasm, the horror genre started amping up with the sequels. Like you mentioned, Nightmare 4 really started going big, Nightmare 3. But, Evil Dead 2, a lot of those sequels in the 80s just was like bigger, better, and Phantasm followed that path. After Beastmaster, which was comparatively huge after Phantasm, could Don Coscarelli have gone back and made a small, intimate horror film again like that? I don't know. I don't think he could today. I just think he's making different movies. But to go to what Bryan mentioned, the earliest genesis of Phantasm 2, in 1979, Phantasm came out and was immediately a hit. It was constantly expanding throughout the year to more and more theaters internationally, to the drive-in circuit. I mean, it was making money hand over fist. And the distributor, Avco Embassy, was thrilled. They sent Don and Angus around the world on a promotional tour. I mean, they were just thrilled with how that was going. And so they immediately wanted a sequel. They wanted Phantasm 2, 1980, let's go. The distributor wanted it. Angus Scrimm was willing to come back. He was happy to return as the Tall Man because he was enjoying the success and he liked his involvement in Phantasm. The one person that didn't really want to do it was Don Coscarelli, who very correctly feared being typecast as a horror director. Now, the shame there is that, of course, as we all know, he did become typecast as a horror director, even though he can do and has done other genres. His legacy is horror. And so in 1979, he did not want to do Phantasm 2 next. His father, who was the primary investor in his movies, obviously having gotten a pretty decent return on his investment, also wanted to see a Phantasm 2. So even
you sure you don't want to go back to that well? We did pretty well with that one.
Oh, yes. And so, he talked over with his parents, and they decided that his mother, Shirley Coscarelli, she was a writer, and she would actually later become an author, very successful in her own right, that she would write Phantasm 2, and that it would kind of stay in the family, but Don wasn't going to write it. He wasn't going to direct it. And so that was the path they followed that year. They even announced it in the pages of Variety magazine with a full-page advertisement saying, coming next year, Phantasm 2. And it was very generic. It didn't give a lot of information. And, there was a script written, but it never took off. And it's a little cloudy in Phantasm history why that version fell apart. But when I would talk to Angus Scrimm about that early version, all he could really remember was that Don's mother had written a story where it's still in the same town as the first movie. The Tall Man is still doing his thing, but Mike and Jodie Pearson have disappeared. And so is Reggie. So the original cast has just vanished. And Mike's young cousin has come to town to figure out where they go.
Oh, my God.
Oh.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah, that's some interesting possibility. Now, was there any discussion with Angus Scrimm? Like, do they eventually, from what he could remember, do they eventually come back, or is this really just the cousin's story?
No, I think it was the cousin's story. And hang on a second, I'll tell you who they even had an actress. Christy McNichol.
Wow.
She kind of had a passing resemblance to Michael Baldwin. And so they were talking to her about starring. And
she was hot at the time too.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. I'm reading my own book now because I haven't done that in a long time. The Variety ad they took out said filming begins in January 1980. And it obviously never went before cameras. But yeah, so it's kind of like you wonder what would that have been like, a return to Morningside Mausoleum, you know?
That's such an interesting concept because I'm very interested to hear where that would have went, but also at the same time, part of what I love so much about the franchise as it has turned out is that it's the same characters telling the story throughout the whole thing. So I'm conflicted.
But it may very well have turned out like that, though. If you think about it, the way that story is set up is the exact same way that the end of 2 going into 3, 3 into 4, etc. is that tune in next week. Mm-hmm. The serial, the cliffhanger, that continuation, that seems more in line with like 3, 4, 3 and 4, that kind of chronology. So that's just one more reason. Well, that and the casting of Christy McNichol, like I said, she was huge at the time with Little Darlings and Family on TV. Wow. That really could have been something.
That Phantasm 2, that version wouldn't have been good. It could have been great, but I think we would have lost a crucial piece of Phantasm's soul if the only constant from sequel to sequel became the tall man. Because essentially that's almost our franchise, where you just switch out the heroes, you get the villain to come back, and that's not what Phantasm is.
Oh, no. No, it isn't. I guess I was throwing in my wish fulfillment basket that somehow we turn it back to 1980 and Mr. Coscarelli agrees that this is a fabulous script and it goes forward and it does shoot in January in 80, comes out in the summer of 80 and is the #1 horror movie of 1980.
And it could have been terrific.
And then 3 brings back in Pearsons and Jodie, and everybody's kind of telling their story, so you get that kind of like that narrative that continues on or something like that. But alas, as we all know, none of that happened anyway. For I guess for various reasons, it just didn't come to fruition. So cut to almost 10 years later, where Universal is kind of looking to beef up its horror sequels and potential franchises. And I remember I was talking to Scott, and I can't remember if this was on an episode or before an episode, but I almost made the mistake of going, Universal Studios has never really had good horror franchises, has it? And thankfully, I never let those words come out of my mouth until right now. But the point I think I was trying to get at in a very dull way was that, they didn't, I think at this point in the 80s, they didn't have your Nightmare on Elm Street. They didn't have your Friday the 13th, the way that Paramount did with Friday, the way that New Line did with Nightmare. And so, Dustin, as you've talked about, they were trying to pull in these potential franchises that were kind of hits for other studios and trying to see if they could push those into franchises of their own.
Yeah, I gotta, to talk about that, I've got to say I'm a huge Universal monster fan, and Universal, their earliest part of their legacy is the greatest shared cinematic universe ever. I mean, the Universal monsters are at the top of the top shelf. And in the 1980s, we almost had the second coming of the Universal monsters, but they fucked it up.
Yeah.
Can I say that? Sorry.
You sure can.
You 100% can. Yes.
They completely dropped the ball. Yes, they weren't trying to create original franchises. They were making sequels to other people's movies. So they were doing Child's Play sequels, a sequel to Evil Dead. They were doing Halloween 2 and 3. They were doing Psycho 2 and 3. And they were kind of like, they had amassed an impressive lineup of pretty formidable horror characters. I mean, this was a really great portfolio that didn't do that well for them. And so they very quickly kind of shook it off. But there was a period in the mid to late 80s where they were cranking out some, in my opinion, very classy horror sequels.
Yeah, and I sorry, Dustin, to interrupt you. I just wanted to interject that this take of Bryan's with the Universal monsters, I hold no truck with it, and I'll be no part of it. I just want you to know that moving forward. It's disgraceful. Anyway, continue.
Thanks, buddy. Always good to have a co-host that understands me and has my back. Really appreciate it.
Well, anyway, that's just okay.
Yeah. So it's 1987, and the head of Universal is Tom Pollock, and he wants the studio to beef up its horror lineup because they see what's happening with Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, and they want a piece of that. And they never quite get it. But in their effort to have the next big horror icon, they say, let's do Phantasm. Let's make a sequel to Phantasm. And at this point, it's been 9 years since the original. And Don Coscarelli is willing to play ball, finally. And, they work out a deal where Don's going to write and direct Phantasm 2, and it's going to be a Universal release, but it's not really going to be a Universal picture. They're not going to make it on the back lot. Universal isn't going to be able to dictate by committee every little decision, but because they're going to ultimately pay for it, they do get to have some level of say. And as a fiercely independent filmmaker, Don Coscarelli very clearly struggles in the studio system. And he does on Phantasm 2. But you've got a huge budget compared to the original. You've got $3 million, which for Phantasm, it's the biggest budget of any Phantasm movie. And you've got it's the cast, the crew, it's all top notch across the board. I mean, it's a Phantasm like no other.
Yeah, and I think that's very, very true. And I think to a degree that's for better and for worse. And it's interesting, that idea of like the something they don't really do anymore, that negative pickup that Universal did in terms of, it basically sounds like, if you make this and complete it and we're happy with it, we'll reimburse you for it, is basically what it seems like it came down to.
Yeah, because it's not the studios didn't really want to be that involved with horror because, hey, this is blood and guts. This is not Oscar winning prestige. It's just like Paramount and Friday the 13th. They didn't really want to be too involved, but they wanted that money. They wanted those returns on a small investment.
And so, I guess in the aim to get those returns on that investment, we do need to talk about the James LaGrosse shaped elephant in the room when it comes to the big casting controversy for Mike Pearson. Michael Baldwin had been a member of the kind of Coscarelli crew even before Phantasm, because it started with his role in Kenny and Company. He had kind of moved on to his role as Mike in Phantasm, and then 9 years later, Dustin, he's kind of forced to audition for his own role at this point.
I see where Universal was coming from. For my book Phantasm Exhumed, I interviewed the casting director of Phantasm 2 and the executive that was in charge of the movie to kind of get their perspective, and I kind of understand it. I mean, Michael Baldwin, they wanted to recast Reggie too. They didn't want Reggie Bannister back. But those actors, Mike and Reggie, they hadn't acted hardly at all in the previous 9 years. They had fallen off the grid. They were working 9-to-5 jobs. I mean, they were not active. And so there's no box office recognition with that. And so from a studio standpoint, when they're trying to maximize the return on their investment, I kind of get it. But if you're going to buy into Phantasm, you need to have an understanding of what made Phantasm work in the first place. And so, they brought Reggie Bannister had to audition for his own role. He took acting lessons from a coach, and Michael Baldwin had to fly in and audition for his own role. And you also had people like Brad Pitt auditioned for Mike. He was unknown at the time. He hadn't been in anything, but he auditioned. And Jeffrey Tambor auditioned for Reggie. And it was really a weird experience for the people that had been there on the first movie, like the crew that came back, because some of the Phantasm crew members switched over to Phantasm 2 in, higher roles. And they were like, this is crazy that they would even consider not bringing these guys back. And so ultimately what Don Coscarelli did was he kind of had a bargain, which was to say that after 9 years, the character of Mike has gone through puberty and teenage years and stuff, he's going to look different. He's a young adult now. You could get away with recasting him easier than you could recasting Reggie, because Reggie was a middle-aged ice cream vendor. He's going to look basically the same. And that's what happened. We got James LeGros, James LeGros is a great actor. He's obviously been in some terrific stuff over the years, but he is really a different flavor of Mike Pearson than A. Michael Baldwin. I mean, he lacks a lot of the good things that Baldwin brought to the role. And so if Phantasm 2, like I think, Brian, did you say that Phantasm 2 was your first Phantasm?
It was, yes.
Yeah, so if you're not the only one I've heard say that. I've heard people say that they came into the franchise with Phantasm 2, and that Mike felt perfectly normal. Why wouldn't it? But if you came in from the first movie, this Mike Pearson is like a self-assured, confident, good-looking action hero. There's very little vulnerability there. There's very little of the curious, spunky kid that we had in the first movie, and so it's strange.
I will say that ultimately the decision to cast James LeGros in this one makes me feel bad for both A. Michael Baldwin and James LeGros because of it. It's this gap where it should have been a role that A. Michael Baldwin was in the first place. So he kind of got screwed over there. And then I feel like as the franchise went on, then James LeGros kind of gets screwed over because it goes back to A. Michael Baldwin. Now, that could have been very well been a thing where James LeGros was like, I probably wouldn't have come back for 3 anyway. So, maybe it's not a big deal. But I don't think, like you said, Dustin, I think for the movie that he's in, I can actually, when I was watching it this time, it kind of clicked as to why they would make that decision, because the 2 is such a different movie. And I think we're going to get, as we get into some of the discussions about kind of the themes and the narratives, it is a much more kind of amped up masculine movie. And so I think the way LeGros is playing it fits very well with Phantasm 2. It just wouldn't fit with 1, 3, 4, or 5. So yeah, it's just kind of, it's a weird, I think, situation for everybody involved. And I kind of feel bad for everybody involved.
You know what? I'm sure it helped a lot of people who made that movie, in their career. Like I said, when I saw it in the theater, I had that disconnect with it. And yes, part of that, was the recasting of Mike, because he's such a unique character from the movie. And by this point, I had watched the movie over the first movie over the previous 8 years, multiple times. So it was a shockwave to have the film start and it's not Mike. And that discombobulation, and not in the good Phantasm way, but it has, Phantasm 2 has that fresh studio car smell, and the Phantasm films, to me, should not have that.
I would even argue with, as far as Mike Pearson goes, Phantasm 2 is the best looking Phantasm out of any of them. It's got the best sets. It's got the best effects. It's got practical effects, makeup effects, cinematography by Darren Okada, who is, he was president of the cinematographers group in Hollywood. I mean, he's just an ace director of photography. The music is just epic. Everything is great about Phantasm 2, except, in my opinion, the screenplay. I mean, if you look at the screenplay, it's a carbon copy of the first movie, but also taking it back to the character of Mike. Don Coscarelli didn't write the same Mike in Phantasm 2 that he did in any of the other Phantasm movies. In the first Phantasm, Mike is a young teenager. He's recently orphaned. He's vulnerable, and he's fearing the loss of his only other living relative, his brother, and he's just got all of these angsts and anxieties. In Phantasm 3, A. Michael Baldwin returns, and that Mike is dealing with his terrifying transition into something alien, into what? A tall man himself? He doesn't know. It's this fear and confusion about what's inside him, and all this terrific pathos spread across them. In Phantasm 2, Mike is this hunky hero who gets the girl and kills monsters and is blasting away with a flamethrower. And that emotional heart it's just not there in the character. And so in a way, James LeGros, he fits that version of Mike because there's nothing there for Michael Baldwin to do with Phantasm 2 Mike.
Exactly.
It's really the same character.
And you also see this be the transition of it there being more of the focus on Reggie. Reggie, you almost forget as you see in the sequels kind of what a secondary character, not that he's not memorable, but he's not in the forefront in the first movie. The first movie is very much Jody and Mike, and here you kind of almost get that sense that he doesn't know how to write Mike. And by he, I mean Coscarelli doesn't know how to write this version of Mike. So he's going to do his best with that, but he's really going to shift over to, it's maybe an easier transition for him to kind of turn Reggie into the chainsaw wielding, quadruple barrel shotgun toting ice cream man. So that might have been just kind of more of a comfort level for Coscarelli's end.
I criticize Coscarelli for what he did or didn't do with Mike on Phantasm 2, but I've got to hand it to him. He wrote and created this terrific opportunity for the character of Reggie that Reggie Bannister, the actor, then came in and absolutely killed it. He maximized it to the highest level, and Reggie is undeniably the highlight of the movie, in my opinion. I mean, he and Angus Scrimm's the Tall Man are never more iconic in those roles than in Phantasm 2.
I would definitely agree with that. Scott, I think
I would say Reggie, yes. I would say Reggie, yes. I would say Tall Man. 3 for me. 3 is the Tall Man at his most formidable.
I like for me, Angus Scrimm can kind of do no wrong. So I kind of like every iteration that he's done. I think there's like little ticks and differences, with the minimal amount of, especially dialogue that he has. I think he does the most with it. I think there's definitely some interesting things here. And we'll get into that a little bit, but just kind of sticking with the a little bit of the background and kind of the lead up to the movie. There was certainly some obstacles or some challenges in terms of Universal's involvement, but Dustin, you had mentioned, and I remember seeing these on some of the special features for Phantasm 2. They kind of went all out when it came to the marketing. They didn't try and just sweep this one under the rug.
No, I think you've got to give Universal Pictures credit when it came to releasing the movie. I mean, they did a pretty terrific premiere. In Hollywood, the big lavish premiere, they had Angus come out in character and costume as the Tall Man. They had a hearse stuffing contest. They had a radio station there. They were handing out Phantasm 2 T-shirts, and they had a game where you threw little plush spheres onto a Velcro image of the Tall Man. Like, it was just a great time. But also the trailers, the advertising, the full page spreads in magazines. You had billboards all over Los Angeles of the Tall Man, and it was like his tie pin glistened, I'm told, but the cast and crew that saw it, in the sunlight. The spheres were painted with metallic paint and just looked so incredible. And so, Universal, I think, went to bat for the movie, hoping it was going to do better than it did. And also, we didn't mention this earlier, but Universal was all in on Phantasm because they not only made their deal for Phantasm 2, it had an extension for Phantasm 3. They had, I believe, first right of refusal on Phantasm 3 because they wanted this to become the next Nightmare on Elm Street. They wanted their own Freddy Krueger, and they were hoping the Tall Man was going to be it. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but even, I mentioned that Phantasm 2 was not a Universal backlot movie. So if you went on the Universal tour, you were not seeing the Tall Man walking around. But even on their backlot, they put huge billboards saying now in production, Phantasm 2. And if you went into the studio commissary where the actors and directors and producers would go to have lunch, Angus Scrimm's picture as the Tall Man was up on the wall. I mean, I really think they wanted it to do well. And I think that's a shame that it didn't do better than it did.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? I mean, there's so many factors, and we can really only guess. I mean, clearly the film that they ended up with, has commercial potential. It's certainly would not be out of place on a Friday night sleepover to throw on Nightmare 4, Phantasm 2, and Friday the 13th. I almost said Part 7, Brian. Silly. Part 6. It fits into that mode. So why do you think it is that it just didn't click?
And when we say didn't click, we should note that it made its money back. It made $7.3 million off of a $3 million budget. I don't know to what degree. I'm guessing that doesn't count. Dustin, if you're saying they went to bat in marketing, that probably doesn't include the marketing. But it did, if we're looking at it kind of in terms of making a bang, it didn't, because it opened to over 1,200 screens, but only made it to 9th place its opening weekend. And it did not get good reviews. Like Dustin, you had mentioned, Roger Ebert hated it to the point where it actually made one of his like Hall of Shame books where he talks about, the movies he really didn't like.
Okay. Counterpoint though. He was a fan of Bubba Hotep and praises Don Coscarelli in that review.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
No, so this is a loaded topic here, but as far as making $7.3 million from a $3 million budget, we don't know what prints and promotion cost, and so you have to subtract that as well from the $7.3 million, and then you're looking at what, a $3-4 million profit. I mean, Universal at the time, now and even before then, they wanted more of a return on their investment. I mean, Halloween 3 made twice what Phantasm 2 did, and they still didn't continue with Halloween 4. They dropped the franchise like a bad habit. But I think there's 3 main reasons why Phantasm 2 failed to meet everyone's expectation. Number 1, it had been 9 years since the first movie, and so Phantasm was not in the movie-going consciousness like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger was. The Tall Man was 9 years old. It was just not a constant thing. People weren't biting at the teeth for that sequel 9 years later. It probably surprised most people. 2, why would you release this movie in the middle of summer amidst blockbusters? I mean, how is it ever going to compete?
That's a Universal specialty.
I mean, they could be like counter-programming. Yeah, well, you counter-programmed it to fail. Well, whatever. And then number 3 is 1988, in my opinion, is one of the greatest years for the horror genre ever. You had Halloween 4, you had Child's Play, you had Night of the Demons, Killer Clowns, Maniac Cop, They Live, Beetlejuice, Nightmare 4, Friday the 13th, New Blood, Return of the Living Dead Part 2, Hellraiser 2, Sleepaway Camp 2, Poltergeist 3, Waxwork, Critters 3, Howling 4. I'm going to stop there, but there's more. 1988, if you were a horror fan, you had options. And Phantasm 2 may have just gotten lost in the shuffle. I mean, I criticize Universal for releasing it in the dead of summer, but if they moved it to October, would it have just had more competition from its own genre then? I don't know. But 1988 was a hard year to reach the top of the pack with horror. So those are my 3 personal opinions on why it didn't do well.
And of course there's, validity in all of it, and it could be a mixture of all of those things. But as that consumer in 1988, who was a huge fan of the first one, like I said, and this just may be on me, but until I opened that newspaper on the day it opened, I wasn't aware that it was coming out. Now, like I said, maybe I wasn't watching TV and missed the commercials. I wasn't up on Fangoria at the time. So I think up in Canada here anyway, for the general public in the area that I was living, it was it didn't get a big push from Universal. In Calgary here, it was playing in the one theater. And it was one of those, when they first came out with the multiplexes, where they held 60 seats so they could fit as many theaters in. And I thought that was odd. But then again, I thought I'm rushing down here because I didn't even know this movie was coming out. And like you said, that age difference, that 9 years, that's a watershed of horror in between. And while still at the time, Phantasm was well regarded when 2 came out with horror fans, and then grew exponentially as well. It's one that almost passed me by because I, just happened to open that newspaper. So
I think there's also an element of the movie didn't know who it was catering to, because it was trying to be more polished and trying to kind of put itself in this overstuffed field of movies that were doing that, while taking away the things that made it unique. If you look at even the IMDb synopsis, we're looking at a much more kind of straightforward movie here. Mike, now released from a psychiatric hospital, meets with Reggie and discover that his dreams, the events of the original film, are real, and they both journey to find and stop the evil tall man from his grim work. And so we're definitely dealing with a more conventional narrative in this movie. And also, there is that discussion of it being a little bit more amped up. This is kind of like that discussion of Phantasm 2 is kind of like the Aliens, the same way that Phantasm is to the original Alien. We're talking about, bigger effects. It's more action oriented. And in fact, one of the kind of Twitter feedback that we got from one of our fans, or from one of our friends, Jamie and Fuego, says that this is a personal favorite of his for the series, and not just because it's the first one that he ever saw. He remembers that Joe Bob Briggs introduced it to him in a Monster Vision episode in the old days, and always contended that it's the James Cameron of the series. And he asked the question, and I think this is a good jumping off point for us. Do you think this action-centric approach led to losing the original's haunting vibe? Now, I would say that by making it more action-oriented, that it inherently does that. But I am interested to hear kind of, to what degree does that take away from the original flavor of the first for you? So Dustin, how does that action-centric approach sit for you?
Both movies came out in 1979, and both movies had aliens with yellow blood. But as far as the difference in the linear nature of the story and the more amped up action, both of those were, suggested or mandated rather by Universal. The first, when I talked to Jim Jacks, who was the Universal Vice President of Acquisitions, that kind of lorded over Phantasm 2. I interviewed him for my book before his passing, and he talked about when he had the earliest discussions with Don, they both saw eye to eye on the fact that they wanted to make Phantasm 2 bigger. They wanted bigger set pieces and effects and explosions. They wanted that more epic feel. But where Don didn't see eye to eye with Universal was that Universal wanted this to be more like easier to follow for the average moviegoer who may not have seen the first movie, or maybe they did. They didn't want to leave the audience confused. And so that required stripping away some of the dream sequences that were originally written into the movie. And Don had to streamline the narrative a little bit. And he's talked about regretting that a little bit, because Phantasm 2 is the most straightforward story of the 5 movies, for better or worse. And so it seems he was, happy to go along with blowing up houses and cars and these crazier spheres, but he didn't like being told, make it a little less like Phantasm, make it a little more like everything else.
Yeah, and I think that's really, for me, the key of why this doesn't click. It got around in 79 and got that word of mouth because people, I think, were seeing something that they hadn't seen before. And even for people who it didn't necessarily fully work for, I think there was at least a novelty to it. I've seen people who watch the original Phantasm, and for them it's something of they go to kind of laugh a little bit, but they still love it, for as weird and quirky as it is.
Seeing the original in, excuse me, in 1980, when it came out on videotape, it was a strange movie, and it was one even at the age of 10 that I had already heard of through Fangoria, of course. But not only that, for people who are old enough, they used to make actual TV guides out of paper.
You lost me. What is this paper
Seeing
you
in
speak
there
of?
one night, it was it's an interesting fiber. And it had a listing for Phantasm, and I think it said something, very short blurbs. A young boy fights an alien missing brother, something to that effect, and it said 1.5 stars. Okay, well, when you're already a horror fan for a few years, you know that even at that young age, that the scale that you're using as a budding horror fan is probably going to be different than the scale that people who watch just regular movies were. So that was back in 1979, and it did show up on CBS, and I was not allowed to stay up because it was on too late and I couldn't watch it. So I saw it on videotape. But like I said, by the time it came out on videotape, it already had a good reputation, facts and figures, as Dustin, said. It was a huge hit. And so it already had a mystique by the time I saw it, only a year. And then seeing Phantasm 2 in the theater, my one and only time seeing a Phantasm film in the theater. Yes, I got Aliens when I wanted more Alien.
Fun fact, you mentioned reading about Phantasm 2 in TV Guide. As many fans know, Angus Scrimm was also a very successful writer, and he wrote blurbs for TV Guide for a number of years.
He also did liner notes for the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
Although he admitted to not really caring for the Beatles, if I remember correctly, right?
Yeah, he wrote the liner notes for the first Beatles album in America, Meet the Beatles, and he was so unimpressed with their sound that when they asked him, would you like to sign your liner notes, which was the tradition, you put your name at the bottom, he declined the opportunity. And so they're unsigned on that album.
Wild.
Oh man, just every story about him, like even here, if it's a story about him not caring for something, he's just so charming.
Well, that's how you tell someone to fuck off. And I can't think of a nicer way, really.
Well, and he talks about it with some humor looking back on it. Obviously, the Beatles were a huge phenomenon, but as he explained it, if you were there when the Beatles first came over from across the pond, it was a sound that no one else had heard before. And to a classical music fan, he really wasn't an immediate fan. It took some time for him to warm up to that whole new sound.
What a guy.
So in terms of, kind of carrying Scrimm over into how the tall man is being portrayed in this more kind of conventional, more kind of amped up, even bringing in kind of more religious notions of good and evil that I don't think are really there in the first one. Part of that amping it up, you do see him getting a little bit more to do, kind of getting a couple of those, one or two of those more Freddy-like one-liners. But one of the things I also notice is that there seems to be a lot more influence from the Evil Dead movies at work here. There's a lot more kind of kinetic camera work. So you kind of get those quick zooms, you get those awkward angles.
The bursting through the doors.
bursting
right?
through the doors.
That's
yeah,
literally from it.
you get the scene where the one guy in the morgue gets picked up by the golden ball, and you're following him as he's kind of getting launched across the room. That was very Ash at the beginning of Evil Dead 2, where they're, kind of launching him through the woods. And at one point there's even, if you're wondering if there was any kind of a intentional nod there, you get one of the bags of ashes was for a Mr. Sam Raimi. So, I don't think this is unintentional.
No, it's not unintentional. Don and Sam Raimi were friends back in the mid 1980s. They were colleagues and they were pals. And Don very much liked Evil Dead 2 and what Sam had done with it. And he actually, when he was putting together his production team for Phantasm 2, he asked Sam Raimi, "Look, who should I turn to for special effects?" And Don hired several crew members from Evil Dead 2. He brought on Mark Sjostrom for special makeup effects, who in turn brought on Bob Kurtzman, Greg Nicotero, and several others. But he also brought on from Evil Dead 2 Philip Duffin, who was the art director, who built all of the sets and created Perigord Mausoleum. And so, Don was directly lifting from Evil Dead 2's production team. And Sam Raimi was also a fan of Phantasm and lobbied his friend very hard to be killed on screen. He wanted to be killed by a silver sphere, which was a request Don Coscarelli did not grant. But the consolation prize was what you mentioned. He got cremated and had his ashes poured into a urn on screen.
It's interesting that you bring up the makeup effects and Mark Sjostrom, because if there's things that we maybe as such devoted fans of the original find lacking in terms of the original flavor being in part 2. The one thing you can't deny is that the practical effects are top notch, and it's, as much as I love part 1 and what they're able to do with a tiny budget in terms of, the finger moving in the box and, the making it at least somewhat believable that this fly is pulling Jody and Mike around, there's definitely much more of a suspension of disbelief in the first one that you need to kind of take, as opposed to this one where things are just so realistic and so visceral. And I will admit that I fell into the trap that a lot of people seem to have in terms of giving Greg Nicotero and Robert Kurtzman the credit, because I think that's kind of what it's turned into. Whereas in reality, Dustin, you point out that this was really Mark Sjostrom's show.
Yeah, it's not to take anything away from Kurtzman and Nicotero. Those guys are obviously and very accomplished special makeup effects creators. But yeah, they got their start under the leadership and guidance of Mark Sjostrom. Mark was overseeing some pretty impressive movies at the time. He did Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and 3. You think about Nightmare on Elm Street 2, you've got that incredible chest bursting scene with Jesse where Freddy comes out. Mark Sjostrom did Phantasm 2 and Phantasm 3. He did Evil Dead 2. He did From Beyond. He did several of the Star Trek TV shows. I mean, he really had an impressive run of genre properties back then, and a lot of really great special effects creators now got their start under him. They went on to form their own companies. But I've got to, as history sorts itself out, some people sometimes misappropriate, someone working on a movie for having supervised and designed and overseen, which is very, very different. Someone helping apply a prosthetic is not the same as having supervised a show or led it or designed it. And I always try and make sure that distinction is made, just because I think credit where credit is due. They're all terrific, but I have so much respect for Mark Sjostrom, who is also, I will say, a personal friend and just someone I admire a lot.
And it's
and
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
Sorry.
No, after you.
No, I was just going to say it's this double-edged sword, isn't it? The higher the budget, there are things you gain and there are things you lose. On the story structure and the plot, but on the other hand, wow, right? A big part of great horror and pulling it off is amazing practical effects. And what I think what Mark Sjostrom and his crew have done here is as good as and can be put up against anything of its time and beyond. He really is a genius and one that I would like personally to see heralded more as well. But yeah, again, it's that ebb and flow. You lose some of that Phantasm weirdness, but you gain a production value that you can't deny. You simply can't deny it, and that's why I always say it's my least favorite Phantasm movie, but it's a damn good horror movie. It's a damn good late '80s horror movie where there's a lot of competition. So yeah.
Speaking of Phantasm 2's special effects, I also have to mention, with that expanded budget, they had some really terrific people working on it, because it wasn't just Mark Sjostrom. There were essentially 3 special effects teams working on Phantasm 2. And for example, take the sequence where Father Myers, who gets the sphere in the head, the tall man lifts him up with a necklace, and then the sphere comes, chops his ear off, and he gets drilled. That took 3 separate special effects teams to pull off. You've got Mark Sjostrom and company that when Father Myers has his ear chopped off, they created the ear prosthetic that could go flying off. Okay, so that's special makeup effects. But then you've got Steve Patino handling the practical sphere effects. So the actual sphere that sticks to his head and shoots blood out, that's practical effects. That's Steve Patino. But then they've got something else on Phantasm 2 that no other Phantasm movie had, which was motion control sphere photography. And motion control is this very complicated, high-tech, remote-controlled special effects process. It's what they used on the original Star Wars to make the spaceships fly around. And so they were able to do that. When you see the sphere in close-up flying in Phantasm 2, where it's in motion and like the blades protrude, that's motion control. They couldn't do that on any other Phantasm movie quite the same way, but you had 3 different teams having to work together to make that sequence happen. And that's just, we've got to thank Universal for paying the check on that one, because they made those awesome effect sequences possible. On the first Phantasm, they were literally throwing the ball down a hallway and reversing it to get those shots. And they did do that in Phantasm 2 as well, but they were able to do so much more.
And for me, the kind of the classic ball drill sequences from 1 and 2, so the caretaker getting the drill to the head in 1, and then the priest getting the drill to the head in 2, are kind of, I think, microcosms for the good and the bad that you get from the difference between 1 and 2, because you get this on a technical level and on a practical level such a leap up in the process. So you get, him getting lifted up by the necklace, as you mentioned, Dustin, so you have that effect. Then you have, before the actual drill happens, they add a little extra flair by having the blade come out that slices his ear off. But then when it gets down to the actual, the money shot, as it were, where the drill goes into his head, something that really caught my eye this time is that I don't know if this was an edit made for the sake of kind of pushing things along or for the effect, or if it was maybe something they needed to cut down for the MPAA, but it's when the drill actually goes in, it ends a lot faster. The drill goes in, there's a little bit of a spat of blood, and it kind of cuts away and moves on. In the first one, that drill goes in, and there is just an extended sequence of all this guy's blood getting drained out. He falls to the ground, and then Mike sees he pisses his pants. And so there's such a personality to that scene that doesn't quite translate in the second one. So I just think, for me, that's kind of the comparison between the two. It's this amped up, better in terms of kind of the technical and the resources that they have, but the personality just isn't quite there in the second one.
Yeah, well, that sequence, the drilling in Phantasm 2 was heavily cut down by the MPAA, who was just having their way with horror movies during this time. They were cutting and complaining and objecting to everything they could. And so in Phantasm 2, that sequence is so chopped down that they actually had to put in the shot of there's a close-up of the tall man's eyes watching that happen that was never intended to be part of that sequence that they put in because they had to cut away. They couldn't just focus on the bloodletting. I think Liz, the heroine, also has a reaction shot when they never intended to have reaction shots. They wanted to focus on the horror that was happening. And so I think it dilutes the sequence a little bit to have to do that, but it's still got a power, I think, on its own.
Definitely. So I think, for me, that's, we don't discuss quite as much kind of the themes, or we haven't discussed quite as much the themes or really kind of unpacked as much for part 2. But I think that's kind of because there isn't as much to unpack for part 2, because it is so much more of a straightforward kind of story. And it's really just kind of buckle up and take the ride. And Scott, I have a similar point of view on it, in that, this is at the lower end of kind of my ranking list, but that's also to say that, if Phantasm, the original Phantasm, is at the top as ranked as a 5, this is at like a 3 or a 3.5. So still a movie I enjoy quite a bit. But I want to kind of take one last round around the room to get any final thoughts, or kind of where this ranks for you in the pantheon of Phantasm, before we kind of move on to get a little bit of input from our fellow Phantasm friends.
Dustin, you go ahead, sir.
If I have to look at Phantasm 2 in summary, I think it's the best looking Phantasm movie. And I do criticize it for its story shortcomings, but to its credit, Phantasm 2 defined the scope of the Phantasm series. It laid out what the tall man is doing, that he's devastating small town America, and that he's, doing it without anyone noticing. And I think it kind of set a blueprint for the rest of the series to follow, and that influence defined what we know as Phantasm to be. So while I'm a little bit critical of the story elements, I think it also was very successful in creating a roadmap for the series to follow on. And I love it. I do love Phantasm 2. I think it's a really fun sequel, all in all, and I think it's great to revisit.
For me, Phantasm 2 is like The Empire Strikes Back of the series. Beloved by many, thought of as the best by many, but really in terms of story, it's a bridge between two films. Is how I see it. I think, and I agree with all of you, technically it's top of the list. The things that I come to love about the series and it's a little lacking in. So a great horror, not my favorite Phantasm movie, but you know what? It's like a pizza situation. Even if it's not my favorite Phantasm movie, it's still a Phantasm movie, which means I'll take it.
Definitely. I think we're very much of the same mind on that one. And so let's hear a little bit from what some other fans have to say about it. So we got some good input from fellow fans of the series via Twitter. At TheJuice45 says, it's fun to see a Phantasm movie with a bigger budget for special effects, but that also means you lose some of the charm. Still the best sequel, in my honest opinion, but doesn't hold a candle to the original. I think you're going to find as we go through this that Scott and I have different takes on what the following sequels will bring to the table. I think we actually might be a little bit more inclined to prefer some of the later entries than this one. Scott, do you think that's safe to say?
I think that's very safe to say.
Right. Also from at Oslo, one of our good friends, Will, on Twitter. He's got a real soft spot for this one. Phantasm 2 was the first of the series that I saw. It got a lot of basic cable play back in the day. The dream logic of the movie haunted me. It was also a great hangout movie, not with my friends, but with the movie, with Mike and Reggie and Alchemy. The sense of dread mixed with the crew on a mission hangout vibes were a tonic to my teen soul. Years later, flipping channels, I stumbled on something with a similar vibe and energy and realized I was watching an episode of Supernatural. The classic muscle car, the weapons, the sense of, well, we'll probably lose, but what the fuck, gotta try, always left me with this unshakable conviction that Eric Kripke watched a lot of the same TV I did as a kid. I really love that homage to part two. Someone that it seems like Will, it's kind of in his teenage DNA. And I love movies that make that connection with people.
Well, let me ask you this, Dustin, in terms of what this person was just saying about the film. For those of us who didn't come to this film first, do you think I think there's maybe, enough mystery in it? It still holds enough. It's just not the amount that we were expecting. But I have to think that in 1988, that this did give off, enough of a spooky, eerie vibe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when I first saw Phantasm 2, I was just overwhelmed by the pure fun of it, by the joy of just how cool it was. And I only think it's only upon closer inspection that you start to see some of what's missing and what didn't feel quite right compared to the original. But by and large, I think Phantasm 2 has so many strong merits to it that it's a really solid sequel. And I see a lot of people hold it high when they talk about great horror sequels. I see Phantasm 2 get mentioned on those lists, and I'd say fair enough.
Yeah, and I do have to admit, because Will did mention in the tweet about Alchemy, I don't think I give that narrative or that plot thread enough credit, as I think Alchemy represents Don Coscarelli still incorporating that for a bit of that mindfuckery that, in a lot of ways is lost. But I think Alchemy represents that, what exactly is going on here, because she shows up as something of an illusion, it seems at first, when Reggie first sees her cadaver in the morgue and then disappears. Then he sees her again in kind of like a dreamlight state when it seems like they're driving by her. But then it turns out that Reggie, because he's kind of making that transition into Horn Dog, picked her up. And then she seems like she seems like one of the team. At the end, of course, we get that reveal that at some point along the way, she turned into the tall man. We're not exactly sure when. So that is something that I remember as a kid, that scene where she pulls off that side of her scalp. That's pretty freaky, I do think that that's still a pretty effective. I think Alchemy kind of represents that that original Phantasm, what's going on here charm.
She calls back in a certain way to the Lady in Lavender from the original movie. Mm-hmm. Only it's more. No one was surprised when because we knew from the beginning the Lady in Lavender was evil. She's killing people in a graveyard. But Alchemy had that twist where we thought she was on the team of the heroes, and it's such a betrayal at the end when she does what she does.
And really, and to get to the point you made earlier, this is the beginning of Reggie's hero journey with Alchemy, because only a man this obsessed with sex, after everything he's been through over the past many years, would sleep with a woman named Alchemy. I'm not saying it's wrong. This is not a judgment call. I'm just saying And that was what put the stamp on the character. That and of course the 4-barrel, shotgun.
And I will add kind of one, weird tangent or theory to this, in naming her Alchemy, and we find out later that the kind of the tall man, his sphere is gold. And as we know, alchemy is the process of turning everyday items into gold. So for me, that's indicative that alchemy is the tall man and has been the entire time, or at least been connected to him the whole time, which for me, and as we all know, the tall man isn't shy about, having sex with his victims to lure them into a trap. So all that to say is that Reggie and the tall man know one another in the biblical sense. That is my take from Tall Man 2, or from Phantasm 2.
All right. So I got to tell you, this is the first time he's mentioned it to me, Dustin. I'm as jaw-gobbed as you are.
I have decided I wanted to blindside you with it because I wanted a pure reaction.
That's wow. Yeah, you got it.
So moving rapidly right along, we will finish off our Twitter feedback with Mike Miziak 4, who says, I love this movie. The trailer was my first exposure to the series. I was like 6 and kept asking my mom, and I'll say this as he spell it, can we go see Phantasma, which I'm guessing is how a 6-year-old would try and say Phantasm. Vividly imaginative with the very best sphere kills in the series. Also a great stinger ending. Series went downhill steadily from here. And again, I will say I disagree with that. But I'm on board with everything else he has to say. But, I do think the later entries 3 through 5 get a short shrift because of their lack of budget. But like the first one, I think they make the most out of their buck. And obviously we'll get deeper into the weeds on that in our future installments. So next up, we have another round of Morningside musings, and Dustin, just to kind of catch you up on kind of what the premise is here. Our man, the tall man, doesn't have a lot of dialogue to work with, but he has a little bit more to say in this one than he did in part 1. And Scott and I like to make very wild and probably inaccurate speculation about really digging into the meat of this dialogue and what he's trying to say. And so we are going to kind of alternate Scott and I giving line readings of what the tall man is saying. Dustin, you are welcome to give a line reading as well, but please don't feel obligated. And then we'll give whatever comes to the top of our head about what really is being said in this dialogue. And so I am going to start us off, unless Scott, we only have one boy reading here. Do you want to take it, or do you want me to take a swing at it?
You go for it. I got the grandkids sleeping right next door.
All right. Let me get into the mindset. Boy. See, I keep clipping it off at the end. I don't get that last little guttural bit, but I think it was better than the first time.
Yeah, you got to chew. You got to chew on that Y, Brian.
Yeah, I'm not making enough of a meal out of that Y at the end.
Dustin, how iconic the first time did it feel when you heard the tall man say that for the first time?
I think it just, anytime the tall man speaks, I think he just commands your entire attention. And whether it's one word that we've heard before and we know he's going to say, I just think you hang on his every word, hoping it's going to give you some clue as to what his intention is or what he's going to do in a given scene. But yeah, I mean, if that was his only line in the whole movie, I would still stand up and applaud and say, I love it.
Okay, so I got the next one, Brian. Okay. Welcome home, boy.
So I think this is just a general welcome back to the audience. He's telling everybody, it's been almost a decade and I want to welcome you home. Now he's going to do this by blowing up some guy's poor house. But this is just, I think that's really what we're getting at here. It's just letting everybody know that you're back in the Phantasm universe and we're happy to see you.
All right, so I like that reading, but I'm going to go deeper on that. I like that line, but if I'm going to, this is me reading too much into it because I'm sure this was not the intention. But if you think
That's
about
why we're here.
Mike Pearson in the first Phantasm, home was a broken place. Home was a place where both parents had recently died, and it was a place of loss and grieving and struggle. And so where Mike was headed back to after the sanitarium was Reggie's home, which was filled with family and love and a young child. And it was going to be a place of acceptance, and just it should have been a new beginning for Mike. And the first thing the tall man does is kill Reggie's wife and young child. And so now it's almost like saying, look, Mike, I'm taking you back to right where you left off. This place that was going to be your home, guess what? It's a place of death. You can't escape me. And it's so dark. That's my fanboy reading of it. And I think it's just so evil what the tall man does in that scene.
I would say that's wildly accurate speculation, and I love it.
Bryan, you are so shallow. That is really, wow, that was good stuff. All right, you go next, because that's wonderful. I want to see how this one goes.
You play a good game, boy. Come east if you dare.
If you dare?
Yeah.
No, come east if you dare.
Well,
it's better than you from Minnesota. Hey, come east if you dare, eh?
Well,
and while you're there, swing by.
He's that weird little maggot baby thing. So, like, he doesn't quite have that same guttural feel to it. Is that where he
does that?
Uh-huh.
Okay. That's the heaviest nightmare influence, I would say, that sequence.
Yeah, no, yeah, I would actually say, like, he's not even talking at this point to Mike. He's actually reaching out across films to one Mr. Freddy Krueger, and it's kind of like a game respects game situation where, you know, he's seeing what Freddy Krueger is doing in part 3, especially with that big snake Freddy thing. And he is, you know, he's recognizing, you play a good Game Boy, in this case, Freddy, come east if you dare, come play with me, and we'll do our thing together and join forces.
You know what? I've heard, I'm sorry, Dustin, I have to just answer Bryan, and then we will get to your amazing answer. I have no doubt. Bryan, you're wrong about that, though. That's not a bad theory, but what it is was Universal was opening a theme park on the East Coast. And this was in the contract that they had to make an allusion to come east, so that people would go to this Universal East theme park that actually never happened because the film didn't take off as they wanted, et cetera, et cetera. It was an early type of viral marketing that didn't really go. That's what I heard anyway. That's what I heard. But please, Dustin, if you have any other insights.
Come east to Universal Studios Florida to ride the Phantasm ride. No,
I think actually it's beautiful.
So I've never understood Come East If You Dare, because Phantasm 2, as I criticize the story shortcomings, it doesn't have the longer arcs that Phantasm 3 teases about Mike's destiny and who he is and where he's going. Maybe this alludes to that, but you guys mentioned a second ago how this whole sequence with the demon tall man in the back of Liz feels like Freddy. It's funny you mention that, because Mark Sjostrom created that little tall man puppet in the back, and years after Phantasm 2, he was in Texas at a Planet Hollywood having lunch, traveling, and he's walking around. What do you do at Planet Hollywood? You walk around and you look at the props. And in one of the glass cases, there's the puppet from Phantasm 2 that he made of the tall man creature. But the caption on it is wrong. The caption doesn't say Phantasm 2. It says, this is the Freddy snake from Nightmare on Elm Street 3.
Oh, my God.
Now, Mark Sjostrom also worked on Nightmare on Elm Street 3, and he didn't make the Freddy snake. What was that? Kevin Yeager, maybe? I don't know. But he didn't make that creature. He knew who did. He did, however, make the prop that was in the display case. And so he goes to get the manager and says, "Look, this is mislabeled pretty badly here." And the guy goes, "Well, who are you? What do I? How do you know?" He says, "Well, I made it. I did this, and my friend made the other thing." And the manager just blew him off and didn't care and walked off, and it remained that for years. And then several years ago, that same Freddy snake turned up on an online auction as the tall man? No, as Freddy Krueger.
Oh, jeez.
And I had to reach out to the auction owner, and I think other fans did as well, and say, "Look, you've really got to get this correctly labeled," because the Freddy snake was like massive. Like it was the size of a car, maybe a small car. But the tall man creature is just a puppet. Fits on your hand. All right, I got off topic of your dialogue dissection, but I had to mention that about the Freddy puppet. Sorry.
Yes, but you're bringing so much actual value to this discussion that we are not bringing with this speculation. So we very much appreciate it. Scott, I think you're up next for the reading.
Graveside service is about to begin.
Well, for me, this is pretty straightforward. This is the tall man kind of seeing that there's not a lot of money in the work that he's doing, is trying to diversify. And he's actually like, this is kind of bringing together both funeral and bar/nightclub services. So this is essentially bottle service that they will bring to the gravesite, kind of as a before and after party for the service itself.
Wow. Brian, on the money. I have to back you up 100% there. What about you, Dustin?
I've really dug into Phantasm 2's screenplay, and I have to say you're spot on with that interpretation.
Knew it.
Hey, even a broken clock's right twice a day, so I was proud to get a couple of these right.
Mine's not. It's not plugged in.
All right. Next up, If You Want Her, Come Tonight.
Yeah.
Wow.
I got nothing. I mean, it's very vague. It's directions, but it's not like it. There's so many layers going on here. I don't know, Dustin.
I got nothing.
Yeah,
I got nothing either. After that, after that bottle service gold from the last one, I can't swing home runs every time. So we'll just we'll leave that where it is.
Okay, you know what? I'm skipping that one, and I'm going to go to the next one.
Okay.
Because it's my favorite, and I got to hear Dustin on this one, because this is a classic line. You think that when you die, you go to heaven? You come to us.
I think great line reading. And actually, I'm glad we skipped to this one because I have a very specific theory. We're talking Hollywood, late 80s. I think Scientology is just starting to really catch hold. I think that the tall man is hook, line, and sinker kind of buying into the whole Scientology thing. That's really what the whole series is a metaphor for. That's what the...
And the priest, he refuses to pay another $4,000 for an e-reader or an e-meter. An e-reader is actually a nice thing. So therefore, he has him dispatched.
I mean, this all seems pretty airtight to me. I think we cracked the code.
Pretty much.
I will give both the reading and my theory for the next one. Hello again and goodbye. I think that this is him realizing that there was something to the Beatles, and he doesn't quite remember the lyrics, and so he's trying his best to kind of bring the Beatles to the forefront, but doesn't quite remember exactly what the title of the song was. So he gets in the vicinity, but not quite there.
All right, joke blocker. I got nothing.
And then you want to give us our last line reading?
No, it's not.
And that, I just frankly think, is him negating every theory that we've had about the previous dialogue.
Okay, I got to tell you, I don't have a joke ready for that because I feel cheated. I didn't get to do any homework on this. I will say that's the final line of the movie. No, it's not. And then we smash to credits. But if you watch the trailer for Phantasm 2, it's got a version of that that's completely different. It's in the mausoleum, and Liz and Mike are standing there, and the doors open, and it's the tall man standing behind them delivering that line. And if, as a fan, you watch that and you go, well, why would that line take place in Perigord Mausoleum, which is supposed to be burning down right now? It's the end of the movie. Why isn't that in the hearse, as in the film? Well, as it turns out, Universal really wanted to include that line in the trailer, and Don Coscarelli objected to it. He said, don't put the ending in the trailer. That spoils it. It wins the surprise of it. Don't do it. And so the compromise was that they were allowed to go back and film that, just that one line on the soundstage for the mausoleum, just in between shots for a different day, so that Universal could still get that fun trailer line of "No, it's not," without completely ruining the ending.
And you got to think that Coscarelli is pretty prescient in thinking that, because since then, quite a bit you see movies that they literally show like the last line of the movie in the trailer, and I know every time that I've seen it, I'm like, wait. Are we, because you can see it coming then, like when you're getting to the end of the movie and your brain is kind of, the gears are turning and you're realizing what's coming. And it's like, I'm about to see the ending of this movie as it was already spoiled in the trailer.
That drove me crazy for years as a fan, watching that and reading the script, and I'm not seeing that in the script, trying to figure out, why are they back inside the mausoleum, which is supposed to be on fire? It wasn't until years later that a crew member and a wonderful personal friend, Kristen Deem, shared with me why it was that way. But Don Coscarelli was very ahead of his time, trying to avoid spoilers, I think, back then, because in 1988, no one is like watching a trailer on YouTube over and over. You're seeing it one time really quickly in a movie theater or on television.
My Lord, if we had YouTube back in 1988, well, no, I can't speak for Bryan on this. We would be watching this like the Zapruder film, over the trailer, over and over and again, watching
the sphere scene, back and to the left, back and to the left.
Exactly. Because when you are a PH fan,
yes,
you're in for life. And even though I have said some things about this film, this Eve, that some fans would maybe frown upon, I still love this movie. It's just, it has two places. It has its place in 80s horror, and it has its place in the Phantasm universe. I think its place in 80s horror kicks ass. And as I said before, pizza is pizza. It's still a Phantasm movie, and I still cherish it.
Very much agree. And in that spirit, we have one final little segment here before we bring things to an end. We have our Scrim Awards. So want to go around the room and get a little bit about what is your favorite aspect of the film. And that can be a scene. It can be, if you just want to say the cinematography in general or the effects, what for you is the highlight of Phantasm 2. And Dustin, since you're our guest, let's let you take first swing.
Well, it's a bit of a cheat to say the Scrim Award goes to Angus Scrimm, but I think, there's so many wonderful parts and performances in Phantasm 2, but I just think it is absolutely made by the few moments that the tall man is on screen. I think he commands the screen when he's on there. I just think Angus Scrimm is at the very top of his game in this one, and I love it.
It's not a cheat. Dustin, because I think on our first episode, did we not give the inaugural Scrim Award to Angus Scrim?
God, but see, that's short changes like Reggie. Reggie is so wonderful and underappreciated. He deserves a Reggie Award. There we go.
Well, so that carries, I think, is good to carry into my award for this, is actually going to Reggie Bannister, especially having learned that, like Michael Baldwin, he really hadn't acted much since the last Phantasm movie. He is so natural, and I'll say a specific part that I quite enjoy is his narration. I do like bringing that kind of noir road movie element to it, and I think Reggie Bannister's line delivery and the narration is fantastic, and I think just him in general in this one is, you would not know that he hadn't acted in nigh on a decade at that point, because he's very natural on screen. So I'm going to give him the Scrim Award. So don't worry, Dustin, he's not getting shortchanged on this one.
Thank you.
Well done. You know what? I am going to give my Scrim Award in this episode to... I'm going to give it to the special effects department, the whole department, all the teams, because, it's one thing for someone to envision something, and then it's another thing to have people interpret that and bring it to life. And the effects in Phantasm 2 across the board are as good as the best of the best, and it's nice for this series to be recognized for something other than the things that we normally cherish about it. So that's who I'm giving the old Scrimmy to this episode.
Well said, sir. Well, that brings us to the end of this installment. First of all, Dustin McNeill, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you coming on board. And do you want to let the people know where they can find you, or plug any upcoming projects that you have?
I work in secret, so I can't plug anything. But if you would like to check out any of my books, including my Phantasm ones, you can read more about them at harkerpress.com.
And highly recommend that. Like I said, Phantasm Exhumed is just such a great deep dive into the not just the movie but the franchise. Absolutely love it. So if you are a fan and kind of all those behind the scenes machinations and kind of all the things that the stories and the false starts and all the great stuff that winds up leading to the final product, read Dustin's stuff, because it encapsulates that so well. That's it for Phantasm 2. We'll be coming back next month for Phantasm 3, Lord of the Dead. And for now, though, we want to thank Bryan, our engineer, for helping us out each and every episode. And as always, we want to thank our listeners, including those of you who have signed up for a Corpse Club membership. Make sure to visit corpseclub.com to check out our latest episode. And if you become a member, you'll get some fun bonus content, including many a commentary with Mr. Drebit and myself. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Every rating and review helps. You can also help us you can also find us on Google Play, SoundCloud, and all of your favorite podcast providers. If you want to get in touch, you can reach us anytime at contact@corpseclub.com, or on Twitter @DailyDeadNews, or at Corpse Club, and on Instagram and Facebook under Corpse Club. Thank you again so much for listening, and until next time, stay scary.